All right, so hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of those who are watching us today. This video is going to be uploaded on YouTube later on, so don't worry, you can watch it later too. My name is Guilherme Casarões. I'm a professor at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo, Brazil. And I'm the head of the Secretariat of GPPN. So I'm here as the host and the moderator of this conversation today, which is entitled Artificial Intelligence in Elections, Challenges and Opportunities. So what are the impacts of artificial intelligence on electoral processes worldwide? AI technologies such as machine learning and natural language processing are being increasingly utilized in election campaigns for voter outreach, targeted advertising, and data analysis. These tools enable political campaigns to engage with voters more effectively and tailor messages to specific demographics, potentially increasing voter turnout and engagement. However, there are also significant challenges posed by AI in elections. Among the main concerns are the potential for AI-driven misinformation and deepfakes, which could manipulate public opinion and disrupt the democratic process. Additionally, there are ethical implications of using AI for voter profiling and data privacy issues, emphasizing the need for regulatory frameworks to ensure transparency and fairness in AI applications within electoral contexts. How can AI be used to strengthen electoral integrity and safeguard democratic processes? So we're here today with our expert panelists in this fifth webinar of the GPPN Thinking Public Policy series to hear their take on the impact and consequences of the use of AI in elections worldwide. I have three speakers with me today. The first one is Andrea Hummel. I might have butchered it. I'm so sorry.
All good.
She's the Dean of Executive Education and Professor of Communication in Politics and Civil Society at the Hertie School in Berlin. Her research interests are comparative political communications, political parties, and public affairs. She was Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Modern German Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and has been a visiting fellow at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., and the Australian National University in Canberra. She's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal for Political Consulting and Political Advice, and also works as a consultant to political and corporate campaigns. She obtained her master's degree from the San Francisco University within a cross-registration program with the University of California at Berkeley, and a PhD from Heidelberg University and a habilitation from the Free University of Berlin. Andrea, thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. Now, the second speaker is Professor Eduardo Araral. He's both an academic and a practitioner with over 30 years experience in academia and government. He holds a PhD degree in public policy from Indiana University Bloomington. As an academic, he specializes in the study of institutions for collective action. He's published in several top-ranked journals and was ranked in the top 2% most cited scholars worldwide in a study by Stanford University. He was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, Stanford University. He received the Ostrom Prize for the Governance of the Commons, a Fulbright PhD award, and a Presidential Award for Outstanding Overseas Filipinos. His work has been cited by the President of the National University of Singapore. Now, thank you so much, Eduardo, for being with us today. Now on to Professor Camille Francois. She specializes in how organized actors use digital technologies to harm society and individuals. Her work to understand and mitigate digital harms spans from cyber conflict to online harassment. She has advised governments and parliamentary committees on both sides of the Atlantic, from investigating Russian interference in the 2016 elections in the United States on behalf of the US Senate Select Intelligence Committee, to leading the French government's recent inquiry into the economic opportunities and social challenges presented by the metaverse. Camille serves on the adjunct faculty of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She's an affiliate scholar of the Harvard Beckman Klein Center for Internet and Society, a PhD candidate at the French Institute of Geopolitics, a Fulbright scholar, and a young leader of the French American Foundation. She holds a master's in human rights from the French Institute of Political Science, Sciences Po, and a master's in international security from Columbia University. And in 2019, Camilo was distinguished by the MIT Tech Review in the 35 Innovators Under 35, the annual award in the visionary category for her work leveraging data science to detect and analyze deceptive campaigns at scale. She was also distinguished by Time magazine as one of the 100 next most influential people in the world for her work on trust and safety. Camille, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm thrilled and I'm glad to have you all to share your expertise with us. So each speaker will have about 20 minutes for the presentation. We're going to start with Professor Andrea Rommel. And the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Yes, Graham, thank you so very much for your kind introduction and also for having me. Hello, everybody around the globe. I really like this kind of, joint forces webinar. And I thought, or I took the invitation to talk about AI and election a bit more broader, because I wanted to introduce sort of the main thesis of my book, which is, of course, to some aspect also about digital AI and elections. But basically, my book, which will be out next week, is on sort of the title is Rethinking Democracy. And I'll tell you a little bit the point of departure of my book. Now, the point of departure of my book actually is the French or the French words for future. In German, we only have one word, which is Zukunft, right? The French language has two words, avenir and futur. And the avenir is the future that kind of happens, the future we can't change. And that's where megatrends come in, right? I'll say a little bit about megatrends in a second. And futur is the future we can actually shape. And this sort of playing around with words basically was the departure of my book, because my question is, are we as democracies, or how do megatrends actually affect democracy? And digital and AI is one of those big megatrends. And the second question is, now, what does that mean? What consequences does that have, and what does it mean for democracy? Now, the makeup of my book is that I have 5 chapters, 5 different megatrends, and I describe the megatrends first. Then I discuss the consequences, and in a third step, I come up with sort of 4 scenarios. And the focus is pretty much on Germany, how Germany could look like in 20 years if we don't do anything about it, or if we do something about it. So that's basically the book. So let me very briefly zoom in on the 5 mega trends, and then I'll zoom in on, of course, digital and AI. So first of all, what is a mega trend? A mega trend is something like an avalanche in slow motion. It is a development that happens, and that happens to, society as a whole. It affects economics, so the society. It affects culture. It affects us as a society, and we can't really change it, right? Avalanche in slow motion, and those trends develop over 50, 60, 70 years, right? And the question is, how do we deal with them? So I picked those 5. If you look into the literature on digitalization, you will find, I think I have, do I have this on the slide here? Right. I was thinking also of adding, for example, health infrastructure and individualization, but basically I only had a limited amount of pages I could tackle in the book, so I concentrated on those 5. But let me zoom into the first one, digital and AI. I mean, this sounds like kind of, this super duper new mega trend that's happening, and oh my God, we have to do something about it. But basically, this is a trend that has developed already. If you go back into the 1950s, 1960s, it already emerged there. I remember, when I wrote my first email back in the 1990s, I think it was 1992 or 93, I wrote my first email to a colleague in the US. And I think sort of the next big step when it comes to digital was the invention of the smartphone. Right? Then first the World Wide Web, then the invention of the smartphone. And I think sort of AI was around before, but it basically hit the debate or the debate within the general public with ChatGPT coming out probably like more than a year. I remember when I started, or when I just finished my my PhD in the mid-1990s, and I did a PhD on parties and campaign finance, and also parties and donations, how parties and candidates raise donations and so on. And I then very quickly turned to how parties use the internet for their, for their purposes. I coded websites, hand-coded websites, by the way, and I remember two things from back in those days. The first thing was that I presented a paper on the internet and parties at the APSA conference in Washington, 1998, 1999, something like that. And I remember colleagues advising me, don't emphasize too much on, parties on the internet, because that will go away. So that was a piece of advice I luckily did not follow. And the second most and more important thing, especially in our for our discussion now, is that probably until the 2010s, 2012, I would say it ended with Barack Obama's second campaign. The World Wide Web and the internet was something that was seen as positive for democracy. Right? We thought it would overcome space and time. People who did not participate offline, they would participate online. So we'd have more people being part of the debate of the democratic process. It also meant that parties that were not so that didn't have as much newsworthiness as others, because they weren't part of the governing coalition, perhaps they weren't part of parliament, they could also spread their words. So the internet and the web was seen as something positive, right? And I think that changed after Barack Obama's second election. It changed in 2016, with Donald Trump's election, where all of a sudden we experienced that the web, that digital communication, was also used for subversive campaigning. Right? You remember in 2016, all the dark ads and the debate about Cambridge Analytica that entered the debate. So I think that's where the turning point started. Perhaps also a little bit with the Brexit campaign, but I do think 2016, the election between the campaign between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump really marked where the debate about the role of the web, of the internet within campaigns, within elections, had turned around. And I think that's also, I mean, if we go back to megatrends and society, right? I think and you mentioned that, Guillaume, in your opening remarks. I think the biggest fear now is that of disinformation and deepfakes. And why is that so crucial? Because at the heart of democracy, at the heart of an election, right, it is at the heart of democracy is the debate about different positions, right? Different solutions for the society on the way for a way forward. That's what democracy is about. That's what campaigns are about, right? And that debate has to be led on the ground of facts and truth. It can be highly emotional. Emotions do play a big role there. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right? But it has to be based on facts and truth. And that's what we are now seeing, is that disinformation and deepfakes are playing a crucial role now. And it's not that this hasn't been there before. You know, we had misinformation and disinformation and lies in campaigns and democracies before, but we can now distribute this disinformation in an incredible speed. And with the help of AI, we can also produce those deepfakes. And I don't know whether our audience is. I just want to give you one example of or two examples of deepfakes. You know, not all deepfakes are dangerous. I remember deepfake we had last year, Barack Obama and Angela Merkel having an ice cream at a beach. That was a deepfake, right? But you know what? No harm was meant, right? I mean, it didn't have an effect at all. It was fun. So at least some people thought it was fun, but that's it. Okay. Now I'll share another deepfake with you with a completely different dimension. That deepfake is more than 2 years old. It was produced perhaps 6 weeks after Russia's invasion in the Ukraine, and it pretended that President Zelensky was speaking, and it really sounded like Zelensky, right? Saying, you know, we have to surrender now. It is my last duty to tell you, the soldiers, to pull back, to give the country to Russia, and so on and so on and so on. So, I mean, Zelensky, after, he made a public appearance and said this is a deep fake, but you get an idea of what can happen. Perhaps some of you saw this fake in the current US election, where the Republicans crafted with Taylor Swift pretending to support Donald Trump. So I think that's a trend we are seeing, and that is tremendously dangerous. So I'll very briefly walk you. I mean, this is what we are zooming in on today. That's also the first trend I discuss in the book. I also discuss urbanization as a trend and the challenges it brings about, especially the big issue of housing. Housing being the new social issue, and also the growing cleavage again between rural and urban areas. What does that to nations, to countries? Again, if we look into the US, and if you look, I'm sure we will all see those, the US map being blue at each coast, at the West Coast and the East Coast, and the rest of the country is covered in red. The rest of the country are the rural areas that vote Republican, whereas the coast vote Democrats. Perhaps the third one, and I'll skip the other ones because I'm already running out of time. I also talk about demography and migration. And that's also something that has been on, especially in Germany, we think migration, has become a major issue over the last 10 years. No, we have always been a country where people migrated to. So migration is not new. It's an ongoing trend, right? But how do we handle those challenges, and how do we manage to integrate migrants into our society, into our system? Some people call climate change the mega trend, and the way I debate it is, it's basically the debate is about individual freedom and climate protection, but I'll skip that. I mean, and then I'll stop. I think one of the, after looking at these mega trends, three things come about. One is that we have reached a turning or perhaps even a tipping point when it comes to certain trends, especially we've reached a tipping point when it comes to climate, right? We've reached a turning point when it comes to migration. And with migration, I mean that you have all observed the rise of the AfD here in Germany, especially now in the two state elections we had. So people are way more skeptical than they were before. A second finding of my analysis is that all megatrends have social injustice as a consequence if democracies do not tackle these consequences properly. And last but not least, and I say that as a social scientist, almost everything was predictable. And that's what worries me the most. And perhaps that is something we can take up in the discussion, right? I mean, if you look at climate change, if you look at demography, also if you look at global economy, we in the sciences actually have predicted most of this, right? And I think one of the big challenges democracies have now is how do you make politics that asks for long-lasting visions and solutions if the way you think is geared or is steered by the 4 years of legislation you have? How does that go together? And perhaps I'll leave it there because I think that's a nice question to pick up in our debate.
Andrea, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. One of the things that has really made me wonder is that there's so many people out there, especially right now, asking for freedom of expression, unconditional freedom of expression. And at the end of the day, all they want is to preserve social injustices created by, or at least deepened by the digital world, right? So fascinating. And I look forward to the questions and to your answers as well. Now on to Professor Eduardo Araral. He's going to talk about the relative effects of AI on democracies. Thank you so much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is a working paper. I just prepared this for tonight's presentation. Actually, I wanted to discuss this to my class, but I see that some of my students are already here. So this is the first time that this paper will be presented in public, but eventually I hope that this paper will evolve into a journal article. So I will focus on the relative effects of AI on democracies. The conventional view that we all know now is that AI largely has a negative impact on democracies through spread of disinformation, manipulation, and eroding trust in democratic institutions. And you spoke about micro-targeting, amplification of polarizing content, and all that stuff. This we know. I think most people know already this. My argument tonight, and this is the visualization of this channel. My argument is simply that the effects of AI on democracy is actually mediated by the types of voting systems or the forms of government. So here I will show to you, based on some modelings that I did, of course with the help of my AI assistant. Here I show you the vulnerability of different voting systems to AI disinformation. 1 is low vulnerability, 5 is high vulnerability. As you can see here, sorry, it's moving on its own. As you can see here, the first past the post system, which is a winner-take-all system that you see in the US, UK, India, is the most vulnerable to AI disinformation. And I'll shortly explain why. Next to that is proportional representation. It's less vulnerable compared to first past the post because it is a proportional system of representation, which requires moderation, which requires bargaining, negotiation, and therefore it tempers the extreme outcomes in first past the post. It's similar to mixed member proportional representation. Then many of us are familiar with the runoff voting, two rounds of voting. The effect is it has less vulnerability compared to proportional and compared to first past the post system. And the least vulnerable among the voting systems is what we call the single transferable vote. And then let me explain to you why this is the result that I'm sharing. And my main message really is the effect of AI on this information is mediated by different voting systems. So let me start with the first past the post. Those who are not political science, political science is one of my majors in my PhD, and it's only now that I've started to go back to this research. In the first past the post, this is basically a winner-take-all system. And this system, it creates a dynamic that encourages polarization because it's winner-take-all, right? So all parties are just all in. It's discrete. Either you win or you lose. And this encourages a lot of targeted disinformation to destroy the other party. And we can see this, and we have seen this already in the United States, in UK, in India, and in other countries like Malaysia. Of course, this will be subject to more empirical validation, but at least the projection of the model is that in this winner-take-all system would be most vulnerable to AI disinformation. Now, if your country is using proportional representation, this is a system where political parties receive seats in the parliament in proportion to the percentage of votes that they receive in multi-member districts. The vulnerability I rate at moderate to high, and the reason for that is that AI can empower fringe or extremist parties that can lead to fragmentation. I don't need to join, if I'm a party, I don't need to join the bigger parties. I can create my own fringe parties. And you can see this in right-wing parties in Israel, in Netherlands, in Germany, and to some extent in party list seats in Thailand. Simply because AI can do the targeted micro-targeting, and I don't need to join this big coalition because I can play a big role. So therefore, there is strong incentive for political parties to fragment. And again, this will be tested empirically. Then you have ranked choice voting and runoff. So in runoff two-round system, if no candidate wins a majority in the first round, there will be a second round is held, and the top two candidates ensure a majority winner. In my estimation, this type of voting system is moderately vulnerable to AI disinformation because AI can manipulate the first round of votes so that you get to the second round. And once you reach the second round, it will create polarization because somebody has to win between these two two parties. I argue, and this has to be validated, that this is the case in France, Brazil, and Russia. Let me visually illustrate the effects of proportional representation system in a more dynamic setting. The blue one represents party fragmentation, and the red one here represents the extent of polarization. The dotted line blue here that tells us about the degree of party fragmentation without AI. Without AI, without targeting, this is pre-AI world. You don't expect a lot of fringe parties. So you will have stable, if you have three political parties, you'll have a stable three political parties. But with AI and with micro-targeting, which gives fringe parties, or you can have ethnic parties, small ethnic parties, but they can think again about the far right in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in Israel. What happened is that they had fragmentation like this. Whether they've been by AI or something else is an empirical question. Now the red one here at the bottom is the degree of polarization. The dotted line here at the bottom is without AI, polarization would remain low. And the reason for that is that in proportional system, you are compelled to do coalition building. Okay, and you cannot be too extreme. Otherwise, you will not be part of the centrist coalition, right? So parties tend to gravitate around the center, and so the system tries to moderate these extreme effects of disinformation. But with AI, there will be some kind of polarization, but it's more gradual compared to because of the fringe parties. So this is how you can visualize the effect, and I can go on with the others. Let me just end off with two more presentations, two more points. The last one is the single transferable vote, which you will see in Ireland and the Australian Senate, and to some extent in Malta. The degree of vulnerability is low. In a single transferable vote, the voters rank candidates in multi-member constituencies. And the surplus votes from the winning candidate and votes from eliminated candidates are transferred to the remaining candidates until all seats are filled. And the reason for this low vulnerability is that the incentives for coalition, there's a strong incentive for coalition building, and there's a moderates the limit of the impact of disinformation, right? So political parties don't want to go fringe or extreme. They want to have broad views in that. Last but not the least, which I did not model, is the group representation constituency, which is a hybrid system that is unique to Singapore, where candidates of 3 to 6 people, and in this multi-member constituency, you have all the minority races are part of this. So that even if you have a majority group like the Chinese, then you also have the minority, the Indians and the Malays are part of that one. So no minority group is left behind as a result of this group representation constituency. I have not yet finished the modeling. But the long and short of my presentation is that I think it's enough for me to show that the effects of AI and or disinformation on democracy is actually mediated by different types of voting system. I think I'll end my presentation there, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. That was fascinating. And for everything that I've read about it, I think it's a very new and innovative perspective on AI in elections. I mean, to split it by different types of electoral systems is quite new and very, very interesting. I mean, thank you so much for that. And I look forward for the questions and answers as well. Now on to Professor Camille Francois. Thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm also still thinking about the presentation we just heard. It's a really good introduction to sort of break it down by how this affects different voting systems. What I'll try to do for us is to sort of take a step back on this question of how is AI disrupting elections, and talk about a few sort of trends that are around it and what we've learned since the last, roughly 12 months on how that's going in practice. And I will say that's generally a topic that causes a lot of confusion. We started mostly the year with a lot of people saying that AI will break elections around the world at a time where global elections are at an all-time high, right? There's a lot of global elections scheduled for 2024 onwards. And then on the other hand, there's also a series of experts who are saying, no, we've vastly overblown and overestimated AI's impact on election. It was just 3 weeks ago, for instance, that there's a recent article in the MIT Tech Review that's saying all of this AI fears on election is overhyped. And so I think that in order to find our balance in this, right, it's helpful to sort of break down the different strains in which AI will have an impact on elections. And where I want to focus together today for our discussion is the piece related to the information ecosystem. That's not the only piece, right? There's a lot of ways in which you can use, for instance, AI to facilitate the process and the handling of election. But I want to focus on the information ecosystem bit, because that also often dominates the conversation. And when we do that, I think our colleague Andrea started there, but it's helpful to keep in mind that our core concerns with the way the current technologies we use and the platforms we use impact electoral integrity really date back to 2016 and not necessarily before. And that is because for a long time, Silicon Valley had a little bit of a blind spot on how their services or products were shaping electoral conversations. In that moment of reckoning in 2016, we talked about it, different things played a role. Cambridge Analytica, of course, played a role, but the campaign, there was the Russian interference campaign to target the 2016 presidential election, really played a pivotal role in confronting Silicon Valley to the idea that their services could be used by foreign actors, could be abused by foreign actors to really facilitate information interference in elections. And that was a really important moment because what happens just after, between 2017 to 2020, is a very fast and creative and innovative development out of a lot of policies, tools, teams, new transparency measures that are fully dedicated to preserving electoral integrity in a changing information environment. And so between 2017 and 2020, we see a lot of, again, new teams being put in place, new tools being put in place, new transparency measures. We see platforms for the first time saying every time we catch a bad actor trying to interfere with elections, we're going to publicly share this information in an open database, right? So all of that was very new. And why that matters for us is the reality is it started winding down after 2020. And since 2020, for the last 4 years, what we saw is a lot of sort of going backwards on those initial safeguards that had been developed post 2027. And we saw, for instance, a lot of, policies being rolled back, a lot of tools being unplugged, a lot of the teams who were in charge of electoral integrity being let go. Because all of this is taking place at the sort of same moment that generative AI enters our information ecosystem in such a way, sometimes it's a little bit hard to sort of separate what comes from this sort of rollback of the safeguards and what comes from the addition of a new technology. But of course, those two are deeply, deeply interlinked. The other thing that generative AI does here in this context is bring a whole lot of new entrants, new platforms, right? And you have new platforms. Sometimes they're adopting some of the earlier safeguards. Sometimes they're doing without. And then, of course, you have some more powerful voices who are being very vocal about saying, we don't want electoral integrity safeguards. I think of, for instance, X and the way they've changed really their approach to these questions after 2020. So all of this is a backdrop on which we have to situate ourselves if we really want to understand the impact of AI, and again, in this context of generative AI in the information ecosystem and how that shapes elections. The way, for instance, I think about like a good example for a way it accelerates some of these issues is a topic on which the Institute of Global Politics at Columbia just published a large report, which is the targeting of women candidates with deepfake porn. That is extraordinarily damaging to our elections. It's extraordinarily damaging to women participation in public life. Here, of course, AI plays a role. It enables this creation of deepfakes, but really you see that the issue that it sort of accelerates is this whole underlying host of problems with platforms failing to prioritize gender-based violence and failing to prioritize hate and harassment. And so it's quite critical when we see platforms sort of make a series of commitments publicly, as they've done this year. I think, for instance, at the Munich Security Conference, we saw a lot of the major platforms say, okay, we care about AI in elections, and sort of like creating new commitments. I think it's important for us to sort of, again, think back to, okay, how do those issues are being accelerated by some underlying problems that we still want platforms to continue focusing on, right? Because otherwise we're kind of using the AI debate to escape velocity on the overarching question of platform accountability. So taking this sort of forward, one key area on which I think we should continue focusing as scholars that's pertinent to those questions of the electoral integrity and prior safeguards is we're in 2024 at a moment when scholars and researchers' ability to access platform data for research is back at being very low. Again, a lot of the tools, for instance, CrowdTangle, which Meta had been made available to researchers, now have been rolled back. And so at a moment where we're really interested in understanding better what are the real empirical effects of these new technology on the conversations we're having online and on our information ecosystem, we're lacking those sort of critical tools. So that's for the platforms. Let me just say a word on the fact that we often focus on platforms and industry players, which I think is very fair. But there's also a lot of interesting policy conversations to be had on what do we expect from campaigns and from candidate when we think about the use of AI in elections. We could, for instance, decide that there's a series of uses that we may want more transparency on, and that there's accountability that those campaigns and candidate owe to the public. And I'm not suggesting that every campaign staffer who uses ChatGPT or Claude or Mistral Le Chat needs to, do an online declaration, but I think it might be interesting to discuss what are the types of uses on which we might want to hear from campaigns on the ways they're using generative AI to do voter targeting, or for instance, to do image generation to illustrate this and that. I want to sort of close this. I want to leave some room for discussion, but close it quickly on this question specifically on information operations and in which way generative AI and new tools of AI are sort of shaping information operations. And there's sort of like a few salient characteristics to take, which I think are helpful to recap. The first one is that generative AI, we can see it is indeed used by actors who are engaged in using information operations to target election. That's not really a new trend. As somebody who spent a lot of my career exposing these types of operation, the first time I saw the use of generative AI to generate those fake profile pictures at scale was in 2019. And so it's helpful for us to remember that ChatGPT entered the mainstream way after, but the actors who were focused on disinformation, of course, had knowledge and access of these tools way prior to that. So it's not a new trend in the world of information operation, although we can say it's accelerating. And the second thing is when we look at how sophisticated actors are using these tools for information operation, it's very clearly used for production, right? So to make content easier, more content, but it's not really helpful for dissemination. And when we think of information operation, dissemination tends to be the bottleneck, right? So it's easier to craft content. You can craft more of these, but it doesn't mean that you're going to have an easier time disseminating and, for instance, creating more fake accounts that are going to be more effective at reaching their target. There's also this idea that we are still testing and inventing the safety safeguards that are going to protect us from these new uses. We've seen, for instance, refusals. A lot of these bots, if you say, I need to design a very complicated information operation to interfere in an election, you will hit an interstitial little prompt that will tell you, no, I would like to not do that. This is against our policies. And that's interesting and that's good. A lot of people are still testing that. The reality too is that this is quite easy to go around. There's something that we do with my students is this, collaborative red teaming. It's often quite trivial to make these systems do something that they're not supposed to do, and that's even without discussing the fact that there's a whole underground market of models that are not only just without the safeguards, that are sometimes even optimized for more malicious uses, right? So optimized for fraud or optimized for phishing. So we're still very much in a moment where we're testing out those safeguards. The good news is some of those large companies, I think of OpenAI, for instance, are also looking at how those actors are using their services and are continuing the practice of disclosing this transparently. So a month ago, we heard from OpenAI that they had seen Iranian actors using their services in order to target the US election. And even earlier than that, in the summer, they had also done a similar disclosure saying that Russian actors were using OpenAI to target the Paris election. So it's just a moment of learning how the actors are doing, learning what is it that we can come up with as safeguards, and learning how that's going to stick. Finally, I'll close on that. I think a key problem that we're still unsure how to navigate is that people are turning to these technologies essentially as a replacement for search engines. It's kind of how it's been marketed to them, but we see people turning to these chatbots and asking, where should I vote? How can I register to help at the voting booth? When's the deadline to do this or that? Sort of very basic, questions on how elections function. And systematic testing, like Erlendra Nassan and Julia Angwin did recently, shows that the chatbots are spreading a lot of misinformation. They're not made to give accurate information on these voting processes, but unfortunately, people do turn to them for that. And so here, I think we have a very important nut to crack on understanding how do we make sure that people understand the limits of what this technology is and isn't good for, and how can we preserve the integrity of election in a context where they will go and ask questions on which really this is not a good question for generative AI, and official sources will be better alternatives.
Camille, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Let me start with a broad question for all of you. But let me begin with the story, and it's a story about Brazil's municipal elections. We are on the eve of municipal elections in Brazil. We have over 5,570 cities across the country, some of which are quite big. As you know, São Paulo, for example, is one of the largest cities in the world. And this is where I live, by the way. And one of the challenges that we're having here is that we have a candidate for the first time who's an Instagram or a social media influencer. We've had, influencers before, but not like this man who systematically uses an army of followers to come up with shortcuts from his videos. For example, he speaks on a podcast for 2 hours, and then he hires an army of people to provide these 30-second, 45-second cuts that are uploaded in his Instagram account and in somebody else's Instagram account, providing him with almost infinite exposure on social media. And most of these cuts are also provided by AI. So one of the discussions that we've been having here in Brazil is about regulation. And some people claim that the only way to stop a candidate like this, because you see, if you're a TV show host and you're running for office, you have a quarantine period before being able to run. Because of course, if you have free exposure, which changes the playing field of elections, that's going to be very detrimental for other candidates. But in the case of social media and social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok, you can have as much exposure as you want, depending on how many followers you have and depending on how many people you hire to replicate your speech to everyone else out there. So the debate that we're having right now has to do with regulation. How can we regulate, not from the perspective of the big tech companies, but from the perspective of governments? How can we come up with a sound electoral or political legislation that allows candidates to play on an even playing field? The game of elections is quite complicated. Of course, those who are more experienced in social media have a natural advantage. But how to make sure that this advantage, especially boosted by AI, will not compromise the whole electoral landscape, especially in countries that are not digitally literate, as in the case of Brazil. You have so many people on WhatsApp, for example, but they are not really able to distinguish between what's fake news and what's not, between what's a good question on ChatGPT, what's a bad question on ChatGPT, and so on and so forth. So how what is the role of regulation in this case? Let me start with Andrea, and then I'm gonna pass on to the other two speakers. So Andrea, regulation, how can we work that out? From a European perspective, I know that this is quite of a bit of a challenge too.
Yeah, right. It is a challenge, but I would also say that Europe actually is at the forefront when it comes to regulation. I mean, we have basically, I think we need regulation where everyone is involved, right? You need the platforms, you need civil society, and you need government, right? You need platforms to self-regulate. I mean, platforms have to monitor hate speech, the way we communicate with one another. They have to, at least from my perspective, really monitor that very closely. But perhaps my other European colleagues can help me with that. In the Digital Services Act, which was passed, Netzdurchsetzungsgesetz, Digital Services Act, which was passed by the German Bundestag, I think, almost 2 years ago. Now we also have the European component to that. We do require those platforms to regulate. Second point is, and you, Guillaume, you alluded to that, and that's a very difficult one, is how do we educate our society in a way that they are, able to challenge what they read on the social media, what they read on the platforms, at least be able to challenge it and ask the questions, can this actually be correct? How do I look at certain things? What are things to consider? Honestly, I think this will take a generation. I don't think this is a quick fix. So the problem I have, especially when I look into Germany and Europe, is we do try to regulate, but we are extremely slow. So once we've come up with a regulation, the newest bells and whistles, the latest technology is already there. And actually, we already need to revise the regulation we have fought for and debated for. So I think the real challenge is to build in the regulation and the technology. But that's probably asking for too much.
Yeah. My short answer is I don't favor regulating these new entrants into the political scene. First, this regulation favors the incumbents against new entrants. It's just a barrier to entry. Number two, incumbents already had a lot of advantage in terms of name recall, branding, dynasties, money, and all that stuff. And if you put regulation, you are just discouraging people who have no brand name, dynasty, money, or political party. Let's level the playing field. I'm in favor of regulation if they're dishing out disinformation or whatnot, the negative externalities. But if they are legit, let those who don't know TikTok, whatever, that's their problem. But I think it's a bad idea to raise the barrier to entry to this new entrance. And regulation also creates a host of problems. Who to regulate, why to regulate, when to regulate, how to regulate. And by the time these regulations come in, there will be new sets of behavior around these new regulations, new technology. And it's never going to end. Let the old dinosaurs who don't know this technology, let them die. Let the market for these ideas flourish when it's a lot cheaper to produce content via AI or TikTok or distribution systems, which is very good for low barriers to entry. You don't need patronage or a lot of money to enter. That's my view.
Thank you. Camille?
Yes, I think I'm sensitive to what both of my colleagues said. To Andrea's point, like we actually do have robust regulations in Europe. I talked about how there's an underlying issue of platform responsibility. We have the DSA for that. I think we're still very much in the first year of applying the DSA, right? So we're going to try to figure out what do we actually need to apply the DSA and for the DSA to be an effective regulatory force? And then 4 things specifically on the AI front, we have the AI Act. Similarly, those large, complex pieces of regulations, we need to sort of give them a moment to actually be effective and come into force. I'm also sensitive to what Eduardo said about the fact that regulation on safety can favor the incumbents. That's definitely true. And unfortunately, one of the issues that we're facing, particularly when it comes to safety or moderation, is that there's a gap between best practices and the availabilities of the tools and systems that are needed to actually implement these best practices. Something that we're working on at Columbia University, for instance, is what if we were able to have open source trust and safety tools, right? To sort of help close that gap and to make sure that those safety tools, those moderation tools, are accessible to those new entrants, to those smaller players, because unfortunately to date, that's not exactly the case. And so I am also a little bit concerned between this growing gap on like, well, we elevate as this is the best practices, this is what everybody should do, and the reality of how complex, expensive, and frankly, sometimes gate-kept those systems that are needed to make safety happen on platforms currently are.
Can I follow up with another very short question for you? There's a war going on between Elon Musk and many countries regarding regulation and regarding freedom of speech. What happens when the owner of one of the big tech companies, like Elon Musk himself, challenges the regulation of countries, challenges the legislation of countries when it comes to freedom of speech? I mean, how should we address this issue as scholars of public policy?
Yeah, I guess the question to what happens is we're about to find out. I will say though, I think it's definitely true that we've heard, platforms like X and leaders like Elon Musk be very vocal around certain areas of content moderation, saying they think that this is an affront to free speech. It's also inaccurate to say that as a result, they reject the whole premise of content moderation. For instance, Elon Musk has highlighted many times that his platform care about child sexual abuse material and protecting kids from being exposed to dangerous threats on his platform. And so there's a little bit more of a nuanced set of questions around, out of everything that we've put on the table on safety and moderation, which strands of it are most applicable to what platform? What do we consider to be a baseline for everybody? And again, how do we make sure that people have the tools to implement this and that researchers and the public have the data they need to really understand what's being done, what's actually, sort of slipping through the cracks, and how that really impacts society, democracy, elections, and the stuff that we care about. But yes, there's absolutely a moment of tension, undeniably. And I think we're about to find out how that evolves, in multiple countries.
Thank you.
Can I comment on that? I know you're referring to the Brazilian case, right?
Yeah.
So this is a chicken game. Let Musk or Brazil blink. Brazil is a big country. He might take a hit. Anyway, he's not making money on X or whatever it is, right? You play your game. Your dominant strategy as a big country is you can threaten him. But if small country, you cannot threaten a big guy, a big bully like Elon Musk. So and he's not the only game in town. You shut him down, there will be VPNs, and there people will just move around. So what's the big deal? And X is not the only platform in town. So let's see what will happen to that, right? And if you're standing up for your national laws and you think you are on the right and legitimate and all of the stuff, by all means, Brazil should stand up to bullies like Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm.
No, the Supreme Court in Brazil has just banned Twitter or X from Brazil. So I can no longer be on Twitter. I cannot use Twitter unless I resort to a VPN. And then the Supreme Court came around with an addendum to the legislation that considered the application of a fine of up to $10,000 for those who use VPN to access Twitter. Wow. And that was crazy, of course. And then the Supreme Court had to back off because naturally that was very, very obtuse on their side. but we're still having problems trying to access Twitter. Of course, as Elon Musk loses a lot of money, and that's probably what's happening right now, he might reconsider his decision not to comply to Brazilian legislation. But still, it's a struggle in which who blinks first loses, right?
Why
Andrea.
don't you ban his Tesla also?
We don't have his Teslas here. It's too expensive in Brazil.
I mean, if I can just come in there with
Yeah, sure.
with more of a German perspective, I fully second what Eduardo and Camila said, and basically we will see what happens. But I come from a country where, I mean, if I look at the US, right, freedom of speech basically is the overarching argument, right? I mean, the overarching thing. And of course, freedom of speech is at the heart of democracy, no doubt. But in my country, I observe the debate about freedom of speech now, especially with the AfD, where some of the candidates, Björn Höcke, now is banned to his freedom of speech is limited in some regard because it harms democracy, right? He's not allowed to say certain things, use certain words which link to the Third Reich, and so on. So his freedom of speech is limited, and that's just sort of the frame I look at the debate you have just sketched out.
Thank you. So let's move on to the attendees' questions. We have a question. Joel Ike, he asks, and I assume it's for everyone, what role does AI have in helping voters make a more considered decision in who they should vote for? What benefits or dangers would this pose to democracies? So let me start with Camille, and then I change the order.
Yeah, I think this is such an important question. And
Yeah.
I briefly mentioned in my remarks that systematic testing that Dr. Alondra Nelson and Julia Angwin did on a few months back at Columbia on 5 chatbots. That testing was done with election officials in the US, so state and local election officials. And essentially what we saw is people saying like, okay, I like to know, again, like a lot of sort of procedural questions, right? Can I volunteer? Where do I vote? Et cetera, right? And the answer to these were actually pretty bad across the board. And so we know that there's a series of questions on which if voters turn to these chatbots to find detailed answers where accuracy matters, right? And even on the small details, I'll give you an example for something that I remember that could have been like, a small detail, but important. It's a participant who asked like, what can I do to volunteer at the polls? And then the bot summarized a series of information and said, like, also, it's really important that English be your first language. And if it's not the case, and if you're not fully fluent, don't bother, essentially. And then I remember the election official reacting, saying, like, wow, that's actually not only it's not true, but it's actually particularly dangerous because we do want people volunteering who are able to actually welcome multiple people in different languages. And so, that small thing actually matters quite a bit for officials who are trying to have smooth election processes and respect rules. So this is like a whole set of questions in which I think we should say and try to figure out how to make sure people know they're not AI chatbot appropriate. And then there's everything that people do anyway, right? For instance, if they want to upload both, or multiple candidates programs into a chat interface and have long conversation with the chat interface about it, I don't know if that's something that people are going to do a lot. I don't know if that's going to help people feel more informed. I think that we may eventually design systems that allow them to do retrieval and sort of Q&A in a way that's factually more true and bounded. Maybe that's helpful. I think we're still at a moment where we require like a lot of humility, a lot of data, and a lot of systematic testing to understand what are people actually going to do and what's working and what's not working in the experiments that they're doing. It's a little bit nerve-wracking that we're like all experimenting live, but I think that's unfortunately kind of where we're at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can imagine a situation where voters, especially first-time voters, would actually go to ChatGPT or whatever to ask about this and that particular candidate. And politicians would probably know that first-time voters, especially if the candidates are new, first-time voters would be asking these questions. So what they will do in response is probably populate the online world with all positive images about them, right? Because GPT would only pick up whatever is available out there, right? It will be saturation drive, and you'll be a lot of those 2 hour TikToks on the saturation, and to create an image, right? And politicians would have to look good on their TikTok or their messaging, off message, and all the stuff, because they're building a particular brand, particular image, and in order to get the trust of these new voters. So, of course, the danger to that is that all political parties would also use AI for opposition research, and dig up all dirt and innuendos and insinuation, and to destroy whatever reputation of other candidates there. Then it becomes a wild west frontier, and then people would just be more confused who to vote for, right? Especially in big democracies, presidential system. Less so probably in parliamentary systems, where you can actually know who's your MP, know the track record, and then you vote for the party because your parents says this is a trusted party, rather than voting for individual. Again, the effect varies depending on the voting system that countries have.
Thank you. Andrea.
Yeah, if I can come here and just add to what has already been said. I mean, voting is an extremely complex process, right? It's an extremely complex process where, of course, citizens or voters look out for information, and as you just pointed out, Camille, you know, those chat GPTs and so on, they don't have the most recent information and so on, but that's only one source of information, right? Especially when we come to the young voters, what do? They also talk to their friends, their parents, their peers, and so on about politics. What do they look for? They often look for so-called opinion leaders, people they can trust when it comes to politics, right? And so don't underestimate that this casting your vote is an extremely complex process with a lot of information you process. AI can be one source of information, and no doubt is, but there are many other sources. There are dialogues, there are debates going on, and I think what parties and candidates have to think about more, especially also when it comes to the younger generation, because what I've seen in recent research is that parties and candidates, they do quite a bit in linking to citizens, but not so much with first-time voters and with the younger generation. And I think that's where a more engaged dialogue has to take place.
Thank you, Andrea. Now on to a second question here from Afek Shamir, starting with Eduardo now. He says, I agree with Camille's argument that the onus should not be on AI providers, but also deployers, such as political campaigns and candidates. Would you say that a good remedy would be a cross-party pledge in a given political system to refuse to utilize frontier AI models for voter manipulation? Or would this just be a symbolic but futile gesture?
I think Afir already answered the question. I think it's symbolic and futile. And anyone can sign any pledge, because the dominant strategy of political parties is to win. If this, again, this is a winner-take-all system, I'm going to use everything to win. If this is a proportional system, I don't want to be too bad. I need to appeal to the broader. Maybe there's a pledge among honorable political parties who value their reputation. Maybe you have some of those Scandinavian parties, and people can expose them if they break the pledge. That's fine. But in other countries, there's no honor among political operators, right? And there will be people working behind the scenes to circumnavigate. Again, any regulation that you have, any pledge that you have, you got to assume that this is a competition for power, for money, prestige, and every party want to do all the best thing that they do to knock down the other party.
Thank you. Andrea.
Guillaume, can you? I had audio difficulties. Can you phrase the question once again?
Would you say that a good remedy would be a cross-party pledge in a given political system to refuse to utilize frontier AI models for voter manipulation, or would this just be a symbolic but futile gesture?
Well, I mean, it's not that we didn't have these discussions before. We had these discussions with donations, whether there should be a threshold on donations because some parties get more than others. In the US, we always have the debate about negative campaigning. And now we have the debate about AI. I think it would be good if parties, candidates would say we want to have a fair campaign. Regulating that, I think we'll have a hard time.
Thank you. Camille.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of shared responsibilities. I do think that, the companies who make these models have responsibilities. I also think that it's interesting to think about deployers in this system. I actually quite like the idea of pledges. There are caveats. I would say maybe more positive caveats than those ones that Eduardo shared. But the first one is we don't really know what voter manipulation means. And so this is where I might start with transparency rather than pledges. Just having campaigns be more transparent and clear about how they're using AI, right? Might be interesting. Of course, they're using AI. Everybody's using AI for many things these days, right? And I think that a lot of the uses that they're currently doing are just not interesting. Again, I don't want to know if a staffer is using AI to proofread campaign emails. That's not particularly interesting. But, there might be sort of like in these disclosures, areas in which we'll say, actually, that's creepy, right? Like if you're automating research on me in order to micro-target me and like folks that I follow on social media with precise messaging, I don't want that. I think that's creepy. So having, this sort of first step of like, okay, where are we? Can we disclose? Can we have some transparency? Might be a good way to facilitate these conversations. And per Andrew's point, like, this is not the first time we're having conversations about what are the bounds of ethical behavior in a campaign. That's just a new area of it. And yeah, maybe that can end up in pledges and then voters decide like whether politicians breaking campaign pledges is generally a good sign for how they will behave in office. That's like up to different people to make their minds on.
And depending on the circumstances, voters might even like transgression, right, to some degree. So they might enjoy voting for parties who do not sign pledges or make any kinds of caveats. All right, so we have a last question here. It's for Camille, but I think that Ed can also jump in. How can we get digital media corporations to adhere to any legislation against the dissemination of fake information, especially given that their business models are based on their consumers persistently consuming information that is geared to keep them on the platform? So this is from Imad Hassan Jafri. So it's a tough question. It talks about business model, right? So,
yeah, so
take on it.
It's a great question. And I will say we see different nations approaching this from very different perspectives, right? We see some countries saying at some point, this needs to bear responsibility on the leaders, right? We've talked a lot recently about, for instance, France's arrest of the Telegram CEO for breaking some criminal laws in France. And so there's sort of a one batch of thinking on this, which is to think about like the leaders here have to be held accountable, otherwise nothing happens. That's I would say maybe not the dominant thinking in the frameworks that are currently on the table. If you think about, for instance, the Digital Services Act, right, which was really designed to increase platform responsibility. Here, it does go to some of the business model, and some of the fines that are imposed by the DSA are not small, right? It could go up to 6% of global annual turnover, which is not nothing for, for a tech company. So I think that, again, we're at that moment where we'll see out of all these different regulatory approaches, which ones work well enough. Often I felt we fail to appreciate the difficulty of enforcing these frameworks, right? Making sure that not only we have the right frameworks in place, but we're able to fully enforce it. And I think that's really what we're going to see in the coming month when it comes at least to the DSA.
Thank you. Ed, how can we change the matrix of incentives for big tech companies to adhere to some standards?
Well, change that. Change the definition of platforms. That they're not just platform companies. That's one to begin with. That's another conversation. But they are what they are. They have their business models, whether they are on subscription or ads or whatever it is. They do what they do to survive, right? As you can see, I'm a very realist person when I think about the incentives of politicians or businesses. But why stop to media companies? Why not social media companies? Or why not NVIDIA for that matter? If all the systems run under NVIDIA, why not hold NVIDIA accountable also for all the dirt that those matter? It's the same logic, right? But then again, that's going too far. Probably would say what does NVIDIA know about what goes on in the server and so on. But at some point, you need to educate people you vaccinate people against all of this epidemic or pandemic, and hopefully eventually there will be some people who will still be vulnerable to this. But I'm sensing that young people are learning how to spot deepfake and have to think differently whether they would buy this information, not blindly. And I think people and voters have to think twice about it. But if you're a country where 700 million of the population are illiterate, no read, no write, and this is the first time to see access to information of holograms and dancing politicians, they're susceptible. So the effect varies by levels of education, wealth, and so on. And the timing also varies. If you're close to running an election, it's tight, very tight election. You don't want a lot of dirt and filth at the run-up to the election, right? So you have to hold Facebook accountable for clearing up all the fake accounts or inauthentic behavior during that period of time. And maybe the rest of the period non-election, maybe the effect would be less salient. So I guess there are many ways how to, but governments they lack imagination and probably the balls to deal with the likes of Musk and others, while these tech companies have all the incentive to go around the regulations because they stand to benefit. In simple equation, the marginal social cost of all this dirt is greater than the marginal private or the marginal private benefits that accrue to the tech companies is significantly better, and then that's why you end up with a lot of garbage and externalities. If I would put that in simple economic terms.
All right, thank you so much. So we still have time for your final remarks. You can talk about the main takeaways from your presentations. Let me start by thanking Professor Andrea Rommel, who had to leave us a little bit earlier. And of course, to thank all the attendees to this very interesting webinar that we had on AI and elections. So let me start with Eduardo and then on to Camille. Just a few takeaways and final remarks. Thank you.
The paper I presented is my first attempt. I just prepared it for tonight's presentation. My take is AI is here. Better deal with it, and everybody will use AI how to win and how to optimize winning. And so, if my conclusion is correct that AI and disinformation, the effect varies by voting system, then governments should, I think, start rethinking their voting system to make it less vulnerable, not totally invulnerable. There will always be vulnerability, but some systems are less vulnerable to disinformation. Like the single transferable vote is probably more resilient to disinformation because of its built-in mechanism compared to winner take all, first past the vote. That would probably be my aha or so what conclusion. But I'm new to this field. I have to consult political scientists whether I'm on the right model or I need to test my hypothesis and conclusion.
All right. Thank you so much. Camille?
I will say that it's a thrilling moment. There's a lot happening and very quickly. I think it's the right moment for independent, robust academic research to really be the compass that we need in order to help inform, like, but how is this really shaping our societies and the issues we care about? And so I look forward to reading what my colleagues will be producing on these topics. And I look forward to us collectively trying to figure out what is the right path forward. I think a good blend of being aware of potential risks, being keen to study them, to expose them, to think creatively about how to tackle them, while keeping some room for enthusiasm for the potential good uses of this technology is the right way to approach the month to come.
Thank you so much. One of the beauties of the GPPN webinar series is that we're able to bring together people from the communication background, political science background, technology background, making this wonderful blend of different opinions and perspectives on many, many different issues from the policy arena, but especially AI. I think it's particularly challenging, exciting on the one hand, but also a bit distressing on the other. So I'd like to thank you, Camille and Eduardo, for your participation, for your expertise. And this is the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for those who've been able to watch us live. And I'm going to upload this video on YouTube for those of you who might want to watch it later. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you. Please thank Elon Musk.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.